So we will now turn the conversation towards the international response to the crisis. Speaking this week, Prime Minister Boris Johnson said there were some very grim days ahead for Ukraine.
So the question is, has our response been enough, and should we and other Western nations be doing more? Well, joining us to discuss this and the situation as a whole is geopolitical analyst and journalist Patrick Henningsen. Patrick, thank you for joining us this morning. What has your read been of the international response in the past few days? I think particularly now seeing the international community come together and call for Russia to be cut out of SWIFT.
I think we have to be very, very cautious about the measures that are being taken. Certainly, if you look back in history, well, one major faux pas was already committed by the West, in which they lobbied sanctions onto Russia just for recognizing the breakaway republics of Donetsk and Lugansk. That's not against international law to recognize the independence of these two states. But yet they did that, and they signaled to Russia at that point that, you know, we're going to sanction you anyway, and members of your parliament for voting to recognize these breakaway republics. And so Russia at that point has nothing to lose. That's basically sanctions 101 is you don't take away the incentive leverage. And the West did that immediately by going crazy with what looks like a hysterical global reaction to sanction Russia before. The United States was threatening to sanction them before anything happened. And so that's obviously a mistake, because that signaled to Russia that, well, might as well go ahead and execute our military objectives anyway, and our political objectives. So that's the first mistake. The second mistake would be when you get into sanctioning the central bank of a country, when you get into seizing ships on the high sea, which we saw in the last couple of days in the English Channel, that's a prelude to a wider war. And if you look at history and you study it, this is exactly what happens when you start to interfere with commerce on the high seas in this way. And then there's the collective punishment aspect of it. Sanctions don't work. Look at any other example of this, from Iran to Syria. And there's so many other examples. They actually don't work over time, because if you're still threatening a country, there's no incentive for them to change their behavior if you do lobby sanctions. That's just like basic sanctions theory, but it's amazing how our politicians haven't read the textbooks at all. They just use it as a sort of cudgel to think that they're going to change a country's behavior when in fact they don't. So from that point of view, I think it's a very dangerous road we're going on here, and basically sanctioning world leaders so they can't travel for negotiations. This might become a problem, because if Ukraine and Russia can't sit at a table because they can't meet in Switzerland, or they can't meet in Germany or some other neutral place, then the conflict will drag on. And so that's going to add to the complications and the problems. These things aren't often thought about, unfortunately, by our political leaders. So there's that aspect of it. And also, there's no context to this at all. The United Nations Resolution 2202 was backing the Minsk Accords. That was the mandate of the United Nations. And that's 7-8 years dragged on. And the guarantors of that, Germany and France, in the Normandy format, they didn't enforce it. And Ukraine's open position was they're not going to abide by the Minsk Accords, which was mandated by the UN, which was to de-escalate and have a ceasefire in the Donbass. They just abandoned it. And now the Western media and Western politicians are accusing Russia of walking away from the Minsk Accords. And that's the opposite of what actually happened. So in this information environment, we have two different narratives, two completely polar opposite narratives being spoken of in the West and by Russia. There's very little chance that I think that we're going to get any diplomatic resolution on this. It's a very dangerous environment when both sides are not listening to each other, and provable falsehoods are being spoken by leaders, in this case, by Western leaders as well. So this is not a really positive situation in that respect.
So I suppose my question in response, Patrick, is if you fear that sanctions at this stage are the wrong approach, then what would you consider the right approach to be from Western leaders?
The right approach would have been to follow the United Nations directive on the Minsk peace process. Then we wouldn't have gotten to this point to begin with. And at every turn, the United States actively undermined that. Britain pretty much looked the other way, acted like they didn't know anything about it. No pressure was put on Kiev to realize this peace process. There's 14,000 residents in the Donbass have been killed, residents and soldiers on both sides. So collectively, 14,000 victims, many of them civilians, and are being shelled to this day still. This is Russia's beef. And I find it amazing that this context is not even being spoken of on any mainstream media outlet in the West or from any politician. It's almost like they've canceled the people of the Donbass. They've kind of like disappeared them. They've dehumanized them in that sense. So these are people that have been under siege, as it were, from the Ukrainian military, from their own government in a bloody civil war for 8 years. That counts for nothing in the current discourse in the West. It's quite astonishing. So of course they're not going to be able to communicate with Moscow on this. So what's Moscow looking at this and saying? Well, they don't care about the United Nations resolution. They don't care about the people of the Donbass. They don't care about the humanitarian disaster, the embargo. They've taken out electric. The Ukrainian army has hit the water supply. They've blockaded food going in there. I mean, it's a dire situation. And now the West is saying we need to ship weapons into the Ukraine, more weapons, more arms. And so that's effectively a proxy war, NATO versus Russia, using the Ukraine as the proxy. So any way you add it up, that's how it is on paper. So I really can't understand how this conversation hasn't developed to any kind of a sober.
One of the great things about GB News, Patrick, is that we can have these conversations and go places that the other news channels don't. Well, I'm afraid our time is up, Patrick. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. And we'll go quickly to a break, after which we will be speaking about the threat of war in countries bordering Russia and Ukraine. So don't go anywhere.